Spearfinger, the stone-skinned monster of Cherokee tradition, a shape-shifting predator with stone skin, stalked the Appalachian Mountains, stealing livers with a finger sharp as a blade. Long before European settlers mapped the valleys and ridges of the southern Appalachians, the Cherokee people who inhabited these mountains understood that certain places held particular dangers. The peaks that stretched across what would later become North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia were home to more than bears and mountain lions. Among the entities that moved through these ancient forests, one stood out for the visceral terror it inspired and the specificity with which it was remembered across generations. The Cherokee called her Nununowi, though she would become known in English by a name that described her most terrible feature, Spearfinger. In the 1880s and 1890s, an ethnographer named James Mooney arrives in Cherokee communities as part of his work with the Bureau of American Ethnology. His mission is to document the traditions, language, and cultural knowledge of the Eastern Band Cherokee before these narratives fade from living memory. What he discovers among his informants is not a collection of vague monster stories or abstract cautionary tales, but detailed accounts of a being described with remarkable consistency across different storytellers and different communities. The accounts possess a historical quality that distinguishes them from purely mythological narratives. His informants speak of Spearfinger not as a symbolic figure, but as something their ancestors encountered in specific places during specific periods of Cherokee history. The physical description Mooney records is extraordinarily precise. Spearfinger appears as an old woman, bent with apparent age, moving through the mountain passes and valleys where Cherokee communities make their homes. But her appearance is deceptive in every sense. Her skin possesses the quality of stone, resistant to arrows, spears, and every weapon the Cherokee warriors can bring against her. This stone-like flesh renders her effectively invulnerable, a walking fortress that cannot be penetrated by conventional means. Yet her most distinctive feature is the right hand, specifically the forefinger, which extends into a long, sharp point like an awl made of stone. This digit serves as both weapon and tool for her particular form of predation. The method of attack documented in the traditional accounts is specific and disturbing. Spearfinger does not simply assault her victims through brute force. She employs deception as her primary hunting strategy, using an ability to change her appearance to resemble trusted members of the community. She might appear as a grandmother, a neighbor, a familiar face that inspires no alarm. In this disguised form, she approaches unsuspecting victims, particularly targeting children and vulnerable individuals. When close enough, she strikes with the Spearfinger, thrusting the sharp digit into the victim's body to reach the liver. She removes this specific organ and consumes it, leaving her victims to perish from the assault. The geographic specificity in the accounts Mooney collects is significant. His informants reference particular valleys, specific mountain passes, and identifiable locations where encounters with Spearfinger occurred. These are not vague, once upon a time settings, but named places within Cherokee territory, locations that retain their association with the monster in community memory. The narrative is anchored in the actual landscape, giving it a historical dimension that reflects genuine cultural experience rather than abstract storytelling. The pattern of Spearfinger encounters follows a recognizable structure across different accounts. The monster appears near a Cherokee settlement, initially unrecognized due to her ability to assume familiar forms. A series of attacks begins, with community members found deceased, their livers removed through wounds that speak to an unnatural predator. Fear spreads through the settlement as the pattern becomes clear. The community faces not just a dangerous entity, but one that exploits the very bonds of trust that hold the social fabric together. The monster wears the faces of those who should inspire safety and comfort. Recognition of the threat marks a turning point in the traditional narrative. The community begins to understand that an old woman appearing at unexpected times, a familiar face in an unusual context, might not be what she seems. Observation becomes critical. The Cherokee developed strategies for testing suspicious individuals, for identifying the slight differences that might reveal the monster beneath the disguise. This collective awareness represents the first line of defense against a threat that exploits individual vulnerability and social trust. But awareness alone cannot defeat an invulnerable enemy. The stone skin that protects Spearfinger means that conventional weapons prove useless. Arrows bounce away. Spears cannot penetrate. Warriors who attempt direct confrontation find their attacks ineffective against the monster's supernatural defenses. The community faces a seemingly impossible challenge: how to destroy something that cannot be harmed. The solution comes through observation and strategic thinking rather than brute force. Cherokee warriors studying the monster during attempted attacks notice something crucial. While her body repels all weapons, while her stone flesh turns aside every strike, there is one location that responds differently. Her right hand, the very appendage that makes her so deadly, possesses a vulnerability that the rest of her body lacks. This single weak point becomes the key to her defeat, but only if the community can exploit it effectively. The traditional narrative describes a coordinated community response that represents the culmination of collective observation and strategic planning. Warriors organize not for a simple assault, but for a carefully planned attack that will concentrate force on the specific vulnerable location. The approach requires discipline, coordination, and the willingness of many to act together rather than as individual fighters. The monster that exploited community trust can only be defeated through community cooperation. The attack itself is described with the character of historical event rather than mythological abstraction. Warriors surround Spearfinger, working together to pin down the dangerous right hand. Concentrated strikes target the vulnerable spot, overcoming the supernatural defenses that protect the rest of her stone body. The monster falls not to individual heroism, but to collective action informed by careful observation and strategic thinking. The community that was terrorized by deceptive predation becomes the community that defeats the threat through shared knowledge and coordinated response. Mooney's documentation presents this narrative as more than folklore. His informants offer the account with the gravity of historical memory, describing events understood to have actually occurred in Cherokee history. The specificity of detail, the precision of geographic reference, and the consistency across different sources give the tradition a documentary quality that distinguishes it from purely symbolic storytelling. Whether one interprets Spearfinger as a supernatural entity, a cultural memory of human predators, or some combination of both, the tradition preserves genuine community experience encoded in the language of monster narrative. The legacy of the Spearfinger tradition extends beyond its role as a cautionary tale. The narrative embeds crucial cultural teachings about the nature of danger, the importance of community awareness, and the strategic thinking required to address threats that cannot be overcome through force alone. The monster who appears in trusted forms teaches vigilance without paranoia. The invulnerable enemy with a single weak point teaches the importance of observation and the value of shared information. The community response models collective action as the answer to threats that exploit individual vulnerability. In the broader context of Cherokee supernatural traditions, Spearfinger stands out for the visceral specificity of her description and the historical character of the accounts. She is not a vague, malevolent force, but a being with particular characteristics, specific methods, and identifiable vulnerabilities. The tradition preserves not just the fear of predation, but the cultural knowledge required to address it effectively. The mountains of the southern Appalachians hold many stories in their valleys and ridges. Some are dismissed as mere folklore, others preserved as cultural heritage. The accounts of Spearfinger that James Mooney documented in the final decades of the 19th century occupy a space between supernatural encounter and historical memory, between monster story and cultural instruction. The stone-skinned predator who stalked Cherokee communities may have passed from active threat to preserved narrative. but the teachings embedded in her story remain relevant wherever communities face dangers that wear familiar faces and require collective wisdom to overcome. If you found this case compelling, subscribe to Vanishing Roads for more documented paranormal investigations from around the world. This story was created with AI assistance based on documented case files. All events reference real investigations and reported incidents.